Okay, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Monday night strategic discussion. Tonight we have Susan Kokinda, who has been leading our efforts here in the Midwest in Michigan for 5 or 6 years. And as many of you know, this is a critical battleground for the nation, the Midwest area, partly because of the political demographics, but it's also because some decades ago, and to some extent this still lingers, it was the industrial powerhouse of the country. That's now been spread out in different parts, the South and Southwest. But the bigger question we're discussing tonight is the kind of crisis and potential tragedy of the country, and how our actions today determine its overcoming that tragedy for remarkable success. The failures of this globalist regime in Ukraine and the war are going to become more and more blatant. They'll mutate and become more dangerous, but it will expose the corruption and weakness of this failed regime. The question is, are we as citizens building a viable replacement? Trump is leading that. He's put out a concept called Agenda 47. He'll be the 47th president when he's elected and brought into the presidency in 2025. And he's called it Agenda 47. It's a visionary perspective. And Susan's going to present on that tonight and then take your questions and thoughts as part of the dialogue as we get into this. So without further ado, let me introduce Susan Kokinda and jump into the presentation tonight.
All right. Thanks, Mike. And I'm glad you called it a concept, because we're faced with a challenge. Clearly, if we're going to prevail against everything which the oligarchy is throwing against us and against President Trump, which is completely unprecedented, this is not an election as normal, as I think everybody understands. This is outright war. They are throwing absolutely everything against us. Here in Michigan, where I am, we're in a state where the Democrats control the state house, the governorship. We have a coven of 3 witches as governor, secretary of state, and attorney general here. They're changing the election laws left and right to just shred the ability to have to carry out election integrity. And as in war, you have to recognize, well, they're shooting live bullets, and we have to figure out how to overwhelm them. And especially here in the battleground Midwest states, we know what that is going to necessitate. It is going to mean that we've got to go out and we've got to organize and recruit broad new layers of the population who are not yet committed to voting for Donald Trump or part of the MAGA movement. Now, we believe that President Trump has certainly given us the political or the policy weapons in which to do that. And that is what Mike referred to in terms of Agenda 47. President Trump began putting forward a series of statements under this headline, going all the way back to January, on economic policy, on foreign policy. Many of the proposals are familiar. They have to do with the open borders, the need to reestablish our energy independence. We have to become a manufacturing superpower, obviously stopping the dangerous perpetual wars, which could end civilization, as President Trump has made very clear. But we've run into a problem as we've been organizing around this. We've done podcasts, we've written posts, we've held meetings in various parts of the country. And while there's a certain excitement which is generated around some of the particulars that President Trump is putting forward, we've come to the conclusion that people really aren't getting it. And that's inside the Trump movement itself, let alone the real challenge, which is how are we going to communicate the revolutionary potentiality of what Trump is doing with these proposals to those people who have not yet been won over. Now, I think the first thing that people have to understand, and I can understand why people might run into a bit of a problem here, because if you go to President Trump's website, Donald J. Trump/videos, and you go to the Agenda 47 videos, they're just sort of listed as he's produced them. So, there's probably 25 or 30 of them by now. But the problem I think most people have, and I suspect including inside Trump's campaign, because his campaign is not really organized around this. I think he is, but his campaign isn't. This is not a series of individual proposals, each one of which is in reaction to the insanity of the Biden administration. I mean, obviously, he's got proposals on there in terms of rescuing our children from the satanic abuses that this administration and our culture is pouring down upon them. But what I'm going to attempt to do tonight, and I'm going to be enlisting your help in doing this, especially in the discussion period, is exploring how to communicate to people. And again, our mission is the people who don't yet know that this is the only pathway for survival for the nation, that there is a generating principle behind Trump's policies. And there's also a generating principle behind the policies of our enemies. They didn't just walk into Satan's store and pull this thing off the shelf and pull that thing off the shelf. They made the decision to walk into Satan's store. That's the generating principle behind this. And it really does start with the fact that you are dealing with a conflict between two systems and two images of man. And I'll get into that a little bit, a little bit later in the discussion. But if you're not starting with this, then if you're not starting with the fact that Donald Trump and we have one view of the world, and the imperial oligarchy, which goes back thousands of years, has another view of the world. And to put it in its simplest terms, for starters, it is good versus evil. But if you don't actually start from the fact that there are two generating principles in conflict with each other, you're not going to really understand Agenda 47. And you're certainly not going to be able to communicate it to somebody who's not already in our worldview. So I actually want to start with what I think is the most powerful and provocative of Donald Trump's proposals, which is his proposal that he wants to set up a competition so that to come up with the design to launch the building of 10 new freedom cities in the United States, building cities literally from scratch. And he points to the locked up federal lands, which there's a huge amount west of the Mississippi, where a teeny tiny percentage of those federal lands could be freed up, where you could build a city. It would be a beautiful city. It would be a productive city. And it would be a driver for unleashing our manufacturing in the United States. Now, I want to start with this because all of us who've been organizing around this, and many of you perhaps on this call, have run into the comment that, Trump's freedom cities are the same thing as the World Economic Forum's 15-minute cities. Now, I'm going to do some screen sharing. I have created a slide presentation. I'm not going to go through it tonight. I'm going to be just using aspects of it, but it's certainly available if anybody is interested in it, and probably will be constantly revising it as we figure out what really works and what doesn't. But But this charge that Trump's freedom cities are 15-minute cities came from none other than Ron DeSantis's rapid response director, Christina Pashaw, who tweeted a couple of weeks ago, "Here are my concerns about Trump's plans for 15-minute cities. Centrally planned, government-constructed cities remind me of former communist countries I've lived in. It's a World Economic Forum-inspired initiative to cut down on energy, carbon, and stop humans from moving freely across spaces." Now, Christina Pashaw is not just some hired press flack or media consultant for Ron DeSantis. She was previously a registered foreign agent for the Georgian leader Saakashvili, who ended up getting himself all involved in the Ukraine color revolutions. So she's a high-level intelligence operative whose specialty is indeed color revolutions, which is what she's trying to carry out on behalf of Ron DeSantis right now. But it's not just Trump's enemies who say this. I had a discussion last week with a very well-known leading Trump activist party official here in Michigan, who was only vaguely familiar with Trump's policies and said, "Yeah, but I'm kind of concerned about 15-minute cities." Now, this really does get to the theme of what I'm going to develop, which is, first of all, you've got to start with what is the generating principle. So what I want to do is, first of all, just give you a few examples of what Trump is talking about in terms of these freedom cities. These are quotes from his various Agenda 47 proposals. This one is the one entitled "A Quantum Leap to Revolutionize the American Standard of Living." And, all you have to do is think about the spirit of what President Trump is presenting here, because he wants us to become Americans again. He wants us to be bold. He wants us to push new frontiers. And he wants a quantum leap in the American standard of living. And this is where he talks about the 10 new freedom cities. And a very important focus is that it is going to give hundreds and thousands of young people and other people, all hardworking families, a new shot at home ownership and, in fact, the American dream. And he also talks about this question of the quantum leap of the American standard of living so that young families can own a car and young families can actually own a home, all things which today are rapidly sliding out of the reach, except for the absolutely most wealthy. Now, just to, drive the point home even harder, I made this comparison of Trump's intentions and the World Economic Forum's intentions. So obviously the WEF, it's totally green, it's totally low carbon, low energy, go backward. In the rest of Trump's Agenda 47 proposals, he right off the bat says we're going to pull right out of the Paris Accords, as he did, what was it, his first or second day in office in 2017. He talks about unleashing energy production. He's specific that young families will be able to own their homes, own their cars. And of course, we know the World Economic Forum, you're not going to own anything and you're supposed to be happy. We know the global elite want to massively reduce the population. Trump wants baby bonuses with more people. We know that their 15-minute cities are all about big brother type control. And of course, in a number of Trump's Agenda 47 proposals, he talks about smashing the deep state to smithereens. And of course, the World Economic Forum's world, the globalists' world, is that we live in a service consumer society. And Trump is very clear. He wants these freedom cities, and he says so, and we'll see the specific quote a little bit later, hubs of new industry, and new manufacturing. Now, again, you know, when you have to ask yourself the question, how could any Trump supporter even entertain the idea that Trump would be pushing the same thing as the World Economic Forum? We've referenced on a number of occasions the very powerful speech that Donald Trump gave back in January of 2020, right before COVID turned the world upside down, where he went to Davos. He went to the Davos conference. He walked right into the lion's den, and he confronted the world's would-be elite in an incredible speech, which stressed that what it is to be human is to solve problems, to be optimistic, to create beautiful things, to make scientific breakthroughs. And he just ripped apart the pessimism. He didn't use the word evil, but he ripped apart the pessimism of these guys. So I think this is, I wanted to start this discussion of Agenda 47 really from this standpoint, because again, if you think this is just an aggregation of good ideas, as opposed to evil ideas, which it is, but if you're not thinking about what is generating Trump's ability to put forward these ideas, and frankly, from the other standpoint, what generates the psychotic policies of the enemy, you're really going to have a problem communicating this. Again, especially to people who are not yet on our side of the fight. So, and really the first thing is the question of the intention. What are the principles that are generating this? And it really does come down fundamentally to the question of, what is your image of man? Is it our view that man is in the image of the Creator, that therefore we are creators? We're given the power to discover how the universe works and act upon it and improve it, you know, that we are creatures of mind? Is a policy being generated out of the contrary view, which is that man is an animal? He relates to the world only through his senses. Maybe we're a rational animal because we can rearrange what our senses tell us, like a computer, although probably computers can rearrange things a whole lot faster than we can, which is where you get into the whole world of artificial intelligence. But this view is one in which we are fundamentally powerless to create something new, to act on the world. And from the oligarchy standpoint, you know, the best you can do is coexist with Mother Nature, or as these extreme lunatics are now taking it, basically surrender to Mother Nature. Now, one of our greatest leaders, somebody whom Donald Trump very much reveres and emulates, was very conscious in terms of what principle he believed. And why isn't this moving to the next screen? Okay, hold on a second. Oh, well, we seem to be a little stuck here. Hold on. There we go. Okay. That great leader, of course, was Abraham Lincoln. And he was very, very conscious about this principle in terms of man. He says, man is not the only animal who labors, but is the only one who improves his workmanship. This improvement he effects by discoveries and inventions. And then in another speech, he said, ours is a struggle to maintain in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from their shoulders. And I can't see the entire thing, but you get the idea. And, you know, this was the generating principle. This concept of man was the generating principle, obviously, of our Declaration of Independence, of our Constitution. When Lincoln created the Republican Party, he created the Republican Party in order to revive those principles in precisely this form, and to make the Republican Party the party of producers, of workers, industrialists, farmers, and others. And again, I think that this question of what is your identity? Are you a producer, or are you simply a consumer, scrambling, you know, to figure out how to survive in a world that you have no power over? Not only scrambling to survive, but obviously because you're kind of passive, you're easily manipulated with information warfare and so on. And I really do think that the organizing challenge that we have before us in terms of communicating the body of policies which President Trump has put forward is a question of getting people to think like producers again, not like passive consumers, or in essence, feudal slaves. We've been working on this question of how do we get these ideas across, and we had a meeting here in the Detroit area on Saturday with a number of activists, and there was a very interesting exchange out of which I think an important insight emerged. One of our activists was talking about how she'd been getting nowhere with her daughter and son-in-law, or maybe it was son and daughter-in-law, I don't remember. They were Democrats, and she just wasn't getting anywhere. And she's a very passionate Trump supporter. I'm sure many people on this call kind of understand that frustration. But then her family members had a kind of epiphany, because they were, well, which she helped prompt, I think, because they were saying to her, we must be doing something wrong. You know, we're working like slaves and we can't make ends meet. We must be doing something wrong. And she was able to communicate to them, no, you're not doing anything wrong. This is the system that you're in. You know, and at that point, you know, they kind of broke out of it. And she says, now they're going to be voting for Donald Trump. But this idea that they had to be broken out of the idea that this is normal. This is not normal. And the challenge we have is you have a whole lot of people who think that this is normal. Of course, they're bombarded, you know, by massive psychological warfare through the media constantly. Now, also in that meeting, I played with a little pedagogy, which was to discuss with people the image of the allegory of Plato's cave. And I suspect many people on this call are familiar with it, but I'm sure there will be people watching it subsequently who may not be. In his great book, The Republic, Plato at one point draws the following image. There are people who are chained to a bench facing the back of a cave and held in such a way that they can't move their heads. All they can see is the back of the cave. Behind them, there are people who are holding torches, sources of light, and things behind them which are causing the shadows on the back of the cave, the images on the back wall of the cave. And all the people chained to these benches have ever seen is the shadows on the back of the cave. And that's their reality. That's their world. I think one of the challenges in terms of organizing is we got to be compassionate with a layer of the population which has only known those shadows. And you can't really just walk in and say, no, those aren't real, because it's all they can see and it's all they've ever known. You got to do something else. You got to activate something in their mind. You've got to create an idea in their mind that there is something else. First of all, perhaps how those shadows are being generated so that they might discover that they're simply shadows. But to get them to discover a principle, not just what their senses are showing them, but to somehow activate that which is uniquely human in that which is unique to the human mind, which is the ability to discover something new, to discover something out of, not from the images before you, but through the creative power of the human mind. This is one of the reasons why poetry and classical art is so important. And I'm going to give a plug right now to the two upcoming classes that we'll be having, one by Dan Leach on Shelley, the great poet, and one by Chuck Park on this intellectual tradition in the American Revolution, and also back to the Saturday class from Barbara Boyd, in which she made the point that people like Solon and Shelley, the poet, recognize that the poets have to be the legislators. Now, what do they mean by that? It means that in order to govern a country, in order to uplift a population, especially one which is trapped in this kind of mental slavery, you have to figure out how to trigger these kinds of creative breakthroughs in the human mind so that they can free themselves from the world of the shadows. And that, I mean, that is a challenge. I'm not saying we know how to do that in to the depth that we need to at this point. We're enlisting you on this call and everybody who will be listening subsequently to work with us in figuring out how we actually can free people from this world of the shadows. Now, one of the ways perhaps to play with this that, you know, I've been thinking about, you know, is around this question of what President Trump put forward. How do you get a quantum leap in the standard of living? And that there's aspects of that which I think give us something of a handle in terms of how to begin to get people thinking in such a way that they can grasp this question of a complete transformation of our society away from one of being controlled consumers to one of being active producers, joyfully active producers. And you can tell when Trump talks about manufacturing and energy independence and new cities and new frontiers, you know, he's addressing something very powerful in the American soul. And one of the problems that we have, and again, these are things we got to figure out how to deal with, is, all right, how do you get people out of the trap of being trapped in a world where they don't have enough money, they're never going to have enough money, they're always running after money, and so on. I mean, we had another example in one of our Agenda 47 calls here in Michigan, where again, somebody else who had been having problems with their child, who had been brainwashed at a local university and having, you know, little or no impact in terms of getting through to them, then realized that their child, who's 23, is completely freaked out over the fact that they're never going to be able to afford a house. And then she suddenly realized, well, that might be a place to begin discussing it. But then what is it you're going to begin discussing? So I want to return to some of the slides that I have in this slideshow. Okay, we're same situation. There we go. And this slide presentation I've created on Agenda 47, everything you're seeing tonight is from it, but not in the same order that I've developed it. I actually start the slideshow by talking about Detroit, because in Detroit in 1960 was the city that had the highest per capita income in the United States. Some argue that it was in the world. Now, what was that per capita income? $8,400. That was the per capita income. That was the highest in the United States of America. And the median family income was just a little bit under $27,000. So before I go to the next slide, I want people to think of what you would need today for the equivalent. Well, this is actually an underestimate. And this is also for Wayne County, Michigan, which is where Detroit is. But if you look at the housing component, you can see it's way low. So, we're looking probably at 85,000, 10 times what it was in 1960. So it's not just a question of people getting more money. Some people do have more money. They're no better off than an auto worker was in Detroit, Michigan in 1959. And of course, a lot of people aren't getting more money, and they may be working in manufacturing jobs and other kinds of jobs, and they don't even have this kind of income, which is where so many of the other problems are actually coming from. And so that question, actually, let me go back to the screen share one more time, because I want to make one further point, and that is, it's not just how much money you get, but it's the kind of jobs that you have. We used to have manufacturing jobs, and now we serve lattes. It's the question of the standard of living is whether or not your society is actually producing efficiently and effectively the things which your society needs, which means you have to have manufacturing. You have to have advances in science and technology. You have to have an educated workforce. You have to have a decent standard of living. These are all things that go into a quantum leap in the American standard of living. And when Donald Trump talks about a quantum leap, he's not talking about, paying Starbucks baristas $80 an hour. He's talking about changing the composition of our workforce so that we're bringing down the cost of production because we are producing and manufacturing things here efficiently. He's talking about energy independence so that we're producing sufficient energy here at home cheaply, and we're not building green boondoggles, which are only being built because they're subsidized, and of course are causing a net loss to our economy, because what it takes to build a solar panel, what it takes to build these windmills in terms of aluminum, in terms of the materials that go into it, you're never going to get the energy out that you put in. So we've got these green boondoggles coming from the Biden collective, which will ultimately be a net loss in not just the money that we're spending, and blowing up the budget deficit with this kind of garbage, but it's ultimately a net loss to our economy and to our society. And Trump's Agenda 47 is the complete opposite. Energy independence, put tens of thousands of people to work building American energy projects, and so on. So the bulk of his policies are to make us a producing nation again, as opposed to the enemy's policies, which is to put us into 21st century, feudal serfdom, essentially. And again, I come back to that question of identity, because in the organizing process, this is where the real challenge lies. How do you shift somebody's identity from somebody who is just a passive consumer and is going to take any handout that anybody is going to give them, because they probably, make less if they went to work and had to pay for childcare and had to pay for transportation and all the rest of it, than continuing to get the handout. To shift somebody from that, how do I just survive in this world mentality, to actually being an actor on the universe and a producer. I think it's very important. I saw a poll a couple of weeks ago, which really grabbed my attention. Somebody had done a presidential poll in the industrial Midwestern states. So I'm sure it was Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania. I can't remember the exact combination of states. And it was, a whole bunch of different aspects of it, in the Republican primaries, in the Democratic primaries, but they also polled people, what if it's a Biden versus Trump race? And as I was scrolling through all the demographics, they broke it down by education, they broke it down by, ethnicity and all the kind of things you expect, but they also broke it down by union. How many, they actually were able to single out in the poll union voters. And most fascinating, they broke it down one more level, which is the difference between public sector unions and private sector unions on whether they were going to vote for Biden or for Trump. The public sector unions, it was about 48% for Biden and 33% for Trump. The private sector unions, now, you're talking about the auto industry, the steel industry, the building trades, the private sector, as opposed to the SEIU, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Barack Obama, and the other public, AFSCME and the other public sector unions. But in the private sector unions, which in the Midwest are largely going to be manufacturing, it was the opposite. Trump had 48% support from the private sector unions. Biden had about 33%. It was a complete inverse of it. Now, I guarantee you the private sector manufacturing unions are not telling their workers to vote for Donald Trump. Now, admittedly, the UAW at the moment is withholding its endorsement of Biden. I don't know how long that's going to last. They're trying to use it as a big bargaining chip. We'll see. We'll see where it goes. But nobody is telling those manufacturing sector workers to vote to be for Trump. They figured it out on their own. And they're subjected to the same media bombardment as everybody else. But why can they figure it out on their own? Because they have a different identity. They have an identity as producers. They know there's actually a real world out there, and there are consequences to what you do or you do not do in the real world. They are less susceptible to the shadows on the back of the cave and are more likely to, at least some of the time, think about what is generating those shadows. If you're working on an assembly line, you can't operate on the basis of your opinion in terms of, how the machinery works, because if your opinion, as opposed to the way the machinery really works, you're going to end up without a thumb or something like that. It's a real world with real consequences in it. We've got to give people a vision of what actually, again, generates the shadows. And the fact that you have a layer of the population that does at least think about that in some respect, I think it gives us a goal in terms of what we have to do with the rest of the population and figure out how to present Trump's Agenda 47 from that standpoint and to go beyond. President Trump is very, very clear in terms of things that that he wants to do in terms of restoring us as a manufacturing superpower again. He says very clearly, we will quickly become a manufacturing powerhouse like the world has never seen before. And he has a whole proposal for universal baseline tariffs to protect our manufacturing and to penalize the other countries that are taking advantage of it. Here's his quote from, again, The Revolution in the American Standard of Living. I just did a comparison of how the globalists want to stop all development in the United States, which is that map on the map of the United States. All the red and yellow areas are things they would like to lock up, as opposed to Trump wanting to build things. But again, here's his concept. He says that his freedom cities would be true frontiers for the return of US manufacturing, the invention of new industries, the rebirth of economic opportunity, and safe and affordable living. So he's very, very clear in terms of this. We have to go beyond that, because we also have, as he did in his first administration, but doesn't really talk about in Agenda 47 yet, is the frontiers, the Artemis project, which is going to take us back to the moon and beyond to Mars. And again, for perhaps the older generations, one image which will resonate with them is, of course, the Apollo project, and the fact that for every dollar we spent sending Americans to the moon, we got $10 back in tax revenues, because it unleashed a avalanche of productivity in the United States. And the pie grew massively, which is how you got paid back 10 times more than you put in. Trump has revived that. In his first administration, he began to revive our nuclear industry. He kept alive our fusion program. And now we're faced with a very interesting challenge, which is Japan has announced that it intends to be the first nation in the world to commercialize fusion. And imagine the jump that will have on everybody else if they succeeded. I'm sure when President Trump is back in office, we will definitely have a fusion race, which is a good thing. But I think we have to constantly be thinking about how to give people a more vibrant vision of what it is to actually be a producing nation again. And that is woven throughout President Trump's Agenda 47. And I think his proposal that he made a couple of weeks ago to revive, to celebrate our 250th birthday with a number of things, including a national exposition, which very much echoes the 1876 Centennial Exhibition, in which the superiority of the American system over the British imperial system was shown to the rest of the world. He certainly, resonates with these ideas. And I want to just conclude with one more slide, which is this. Because the Lincoln principle is very much the the American system principle, the Hamilton principle, the Lincoln principle, the John Kennedy principle. These are very much, what we have to get across to people. And again, Donald Trump understands this. When he was in Detroit before he was elected in 2016, he said, "Becoming the nominee of the party of Abraham Lincoln has been the greatest honor of my life. It's on his legacy that I hope to build the future of the party, but more importantly, the future of the country." And I think the more that we think through these questions of the principles that shaped our nation, that Lincoln revived in order to save us, that other people have revived in order to save us, and that President Trump clearly intends to survive, we will be able to communicate poetically and powerfully to our fellow Americans who are not yet with us, the kinds of ideas that will bring them to us, such that we can overwhelm anything they throw at us over the course of the months in which we will be battling to decide who the next president of the United States is. So I will leave it at that. I certainly want to open up to ideas and questions in terms of how we can get these ideas across. There's other specific questions about Agenda 47. The slide presentation that I put together, which you've seen pieces of, has got a little bit more details in terms of some of Trump's proposals and so on. I can make that available to anybody who wants it. But I think this is a work in progress. So I'm joining you to work with us.